Normally kitchen tables are meant to eat dinner on, but in my case, I'm using it to build a plane because it's raining outside and my garage is a mess and the wife is at work. So I'm gonna clean this off. Don't worry, we're putting down a blanket, but I just wanna go over this. This is the first build that I'm officially doing on my channel. I just passed 200,000 subscribers and that is crazy. I'm super thankful for you guys. And I'm gonna be posting more long form videos. So this is the second ARF that I ever built, 92-inch bobber by Legend Hobby. I'm a little nervous about it. You know, it's a big plane. I don't really have that good of building skills. I only did one other ARF. It was a 48-inch Edge 540 from Extreme Flight, and it didn't come out that good. But with the right people behind me, and this kit looks fairly simple to build, I think we're gonna have a great time doing it, and it should come out pretty good. I'm even more excited to fly it. So this is part 2. We're gonna do the build, and I wanna dig into it. Let's get the table protected, and let's get started. The first part of this plane, as per the colored instructions, is to get this monstrous landing gear in place. Now, the bottom of the fuselage is pre-slotted, which makes it easy. We have to unscrew all of these screws that come pre-installed, which is fine, takes only a second. And then guys, make sure when reinstalling this, you're always gonna wanna use Loctite. I use blue Loctite just in case I do have to get it off. Now we screw on all the backs and then move on to the front. Now the front's a little different here. We're gonna use those same little metal brackets, except we have to add this piece right here, and this is for the wings to attach to, or rather the wing supports. So I'm gonna screw that metal bracket into the back, but then it's gonna go underneath the wing support. Again, it's super simple. It's labeled in the instruction manual in color, so you really can't mess this up. And just like that, we're adding the spacers on the axle for the wheels, and then we're gonna put those wheels on and lock them into place. Now the spacer is just a regular bolt, but the bolt that holds the wheel on is a locking bolt, so make sure you don't mix those two up. Now after we put this on, there is a little excess there. You can cut it off if you want. I don't mind it. I think it gives it a beefy look, and we're on to the hinges. Now moving on to installing the rudder, as you've seen those hinges, I added grease to the joints because I don't want them to get glued shut when I epoxy them in. The holes for these are pre-drilled, which makes it super easy. So I got the rudder installed. Now we're gonna move on to working on the elevators. The same process. I'm gonna grease these hinges and 5-minute epoxy these things into place. Now you wanna make sure you have plenty of clearance so that it moves the way it should. If you push them in too far, you won't get the right amount of deflection, so be careful when doing that. Now I'm adding the spar to the back so we could slide on our elevators. And this is super simple. It uses just a hand tightening nut, which I'm not sure why, because as you'll see later in the video, I actually have to add support wire to this. So we're not gonna be taking the elevators off, but it is definitely looking good and I'm loving the color so far. Now I don't wanna bore you guys too much with all the hinge installations, but I am doing it to both of the ailerons, and then we're gonna move on to the next step. But before we do, all right, so I'm just about 2 hours in. I debated even doing this segment because I don't like to jinx myself. Everything so far has been incredibly smooth. It looks like this is a top-notch kit, or model ARF, should I say. Everything's drilled out correctly. Hinging things definitely not my favorite thing to do. It's not hard, it's just tedious. It took a lot of time. Moving on, I let the tail cure so now I can flip it over. I'm gonna put the tail wheel assembly on, and I also need to add flaps to the wings. And we're cruising right along, so we'll see how far I get today, and let's continue on. Now this is the first time I'm doing a tail assembly like this. It's very simple though. It's all in color in the manual. Now this little bracket that I'm drilling holes and mounting is so that the springs can attach to this, to the rear wheel, so when the rudder turns, the wheel turns too, allowing it to steer easier. Super simple. After I got the holes drilled, you're going to see I'm adding a little thin CA, and that's going to allow the screws to really set in there so I don't have to worry about this falling off. Now I'm going to add the screws, I'm going to tighten it up, and then I'm going to move on. I want you to notice on the landing gear, I did the exact same process for that big wheel. And then I'm drilling out the mount that I put on first that holds the springs, because the hardware that's supposed to go in there is actually slightly too big. But it was a simple thing for me to do. And I Loctite the piece and screw it on in. I hand tighten it at first and then I wrench it over just a little bit. You do not want to break these things. Now you can add the springs and the tail wheel is done. Moving on, we're going to work on the flaps. Now Legend Hobby did make our life easy, and they did pre-drill the holes in the flaps. So it's as easy as just adding a little CA like I did before so that the screws stay in there real well and screwing them into place. Now we're going to do it for the other two on this flap, and then we're going to repeat the same exact process on the flap for the other wing. Now once that's done, the wings themselves are not pre-drilled, but they do line up very easily. So we're going to line it up, and then we're going to use the self-tapping screws and just screw them into place and make sure they're snug. The control horns are carbon fiber, and you want to thin CA these in very well. I got a little bit messy, but I can clean it off with a little rubbing alcohol. Now that the epoxy on our tail section has fully cured, we're able to move on to the rudder. Now this piece that I'm holding right here is the rudder servo assembly. So it's going to hold the rudder servo into place, and we have to epoxy it on with this extra support block. It's pretty simple. We just want to scuff up the surface so that the epoxy has a good place to bond to. Now we're going to add a generous amount of epoxy to that, to this, and then we're going to clamp it down and make sure it cures fully. Now I'm not just going to trust this, I'm actually going to zip tie it a little bit because I don't want the rudder to fall off mid-flight. That would be a bit of an issue now, wouldn't it? Now the servos I'm using are high-tech 645 MG, and while that rudder mount cures, I'm going to move on to working on all the other servos. I do want to note that this kit comes with new metal servo arms, which is amazing. So we get to get rid of the old plastic ones that the servos come with and add the metal ones for that extra support. Give a little peace of mind when you're flying at high speeds. So we're rocking and rolling. I just want to stop for a second. I want to talk about these. So you have to actually glue on these wood tabs. You have to cut one because the servo wire is in the way. Then you have to glue these on. Now I've never done that before, so it's a bit of a learning curve. But I'm just using the epoxy. This one's just about done. I'm leaving those clamps on just in case. And it's pretty tedious, man. It's taking me some time because, you know, you got 4 servos. You got 2 flaps and 2 ailerons. So we're rocking and rolling. We're getting this done, and I just wanted to share that part of it. Now this is what it looks like as it's drying. Make sure you guys get yourself some clamps. After that's cured, we could screw them into the covers, and we could slide the servo wire through the pre-installed tube in the wing, which makes life super easy. As you can see, I'm just pulling it through. And once I get it through, I could screw those covers back onto the wings, and we're moving on to the rudder. Now these come with the kit, thankfully, but it does not come with the hardware, unfortunately. But I did have these in the garage, so you guys are going to need to find yourself some screws that fit. And we're going to install these things with some lock washers, and I grinded off the bottom so that I had perfect clearance. Now after I install it, you see I turn it and make sure there's no rubbing on the servo with the self-added screws. This is my first time installing pull wire, or as I like to call it, chicken wire, to a rudder system. So I'm going to install the hardware to the newly added servo, and I'm going to use some lock washers to keep it into place. You don't need to Loctite these because they are lock washers. And once those are on, we're going to repeat the exact same process, except on the control horns on the actual rudder. That way we could get ready to add our chicken wire. Now doing this is fairly simple. We're going to put the chicken wire through the crimp connector, and then we're going to connect it through our servo control arm. Now once we crimp down on it with pliers, we're going to do the same thing to the other side, and then we're going to connect it to the rudder control arms. Super simple. We could tighten it from the hardware itself, thankfully, so you don't have to make sure it's too tight because you're going to tighten it after. Adding the elevator servos is super simple. The holes were perfect. We just slid the servos into place, tighten them up. Now there's 2 servos, one on each side. And what I didn't mention is this tube right here. It's basically made out of straws. We're going to glue 3 or 4 of them together, hide it in the fuselage so that we could snake the elevator servos wire through it for a nice clean install. And moving on to some finishing touches like the seat. I didn't want to spend too much time talking about this stuff in the video because it's so simple and it's in the manual. It just screws in and then we zip tie it on. Now the rear seat is a little more tricky. I couldn't find a better way to do it, so a little thin CA and some zip ties held that in place, and the cluster didn't fit perfect, so I masked off what I needed to cut and just used a Dremel and sliced it a little bit, and now it fits absolutely perfect. I wanted this to fit nice because some of the FPV footage I was going to do, and the tail section definitely is a little more tricky. Luckily these holes were pre-drilled, so after you put these on, you're going to run the same type of wire we used on that rudder servo through this. Now because I'm new at this, I really don't have any tips or tricks on getting these things installed properly and getting them to the right specs or the right tightness. But if you guys reach out to Tom at Legend Hobby, I'm sure he has plenty, or you just hop on YouTube. I got mine tight just from a little trial and tribulation here, and I was happy with the way it came out. I actually had somebody check it before I flew it just to make sure. Now again, some finishing touches. The windshield is super simple, screws right into place. Now, I'm very picky with how my wiring is, so I added the wings. I wanted to get all that locked in to see where the wires were going to be. And if you guys look close, the wires technically would hang down, and I'm not a fan of that. So I added some extensions and some of this covering, and I routed the wires alongside the fuselage frame, and I covered it with that covering. Now I'm going to do the same for the rest of the wires. I want to get everything as tidy as possible. My receiver is going to go right there where my finger is. So I'm just going to tighten it up. Now moving on to the motor, if you want to mount it perfectly center, you're going to go to that center hole. But the manual recommends 4 degrees down, 3 degrees to the right. So you're going to actually line it up with that T that is preset on the firewall. Now that might sound confusing to most. What it is it's called a thrust angle. And what it does is it alleviates, because this is a tail dragger, the thrust from the engine torquing the plane over. Now I didn't know how to set that, so I reached out to Tom Hunt, who's the president of my club, and he actually 3D printed me one, and that's that white adapter you guys see attached to the firewall. Once my thrust angle was set, I was able to measure my standoffs to get that motor exactly where I needed it to be for the cowling to fit. Now putting the cowling on is super simple. I just taped it into place and then used the self-tapping screws and screwed them on in. Very simple, very clean. I'm loving the way this is looking. This recommends gas. I went electric, but all in all, whatever you decide, it's going to be the same process. And then we're just adding some finishing touches like the fake motors on the outside, the propeller, which I'm doing a 20x12. The pilot, which is not too difficult to put in. I slaved mine to my aileron so his head turns when he turns. Add the stickers. And honestly, that's it. So my rating on this model, 10 out of 10. It went together super easy. It looks like it's going to be a great time to fly, so make sure you guys stay tuned for that Maiden. And again, if you're interested in one of these, make sure you check out legendhobby.com, and I'm also going to leave the link below in the description. As always, guys, I appreciate you watching. Until next time.